Hello, world. Chris Pirillo here on behalf of the New Stack. Happy to see everybody virtually that's tuned in live. Of course, if you are tuned in live and you're wondering, well, wait, will this broadcast be available later? It will be. And if you're watching this recording after it's live, then you already know this. I hope you're comfortable either way. We're going to be diving into a topic that is, becoming very interesting to me on a personal and professional level, talking a bit about containers and specifically security. And joining us today from ActiveState, we have Pete Garcin, Senior Director of Product Management, and Evan Prowse, Product Marketing Manager for ActiveState. And I hope you two are doing well.
Yes. Yeah. Great to be here. Thanks for having us, Chris.
Absolutely. I don't know exactly what you've got behind you, but like I'm already jealous as a collector.
These are like plaques from all the games that I worked on. I had a previous life where I worked in video games and worked on lots of different titles, and that's what's behind me there, kind of thing.
Nice. And we also have plants represented, so there's a little more balance.
Yeah, I'm doing my best to keep it alive and healthy.
Which is good. That's the good thing, because I stick to plastic personally. That way I don't have to water anything except for me. So can you tell me a little bit about ActiveState, your history, and what you do?
Absolutely. So ActiveState's been around in the sort of open source world for over 20 years. Started in the sort of late 90s doing porting Perl for Windows, and has been involved in open source ecosystems since then. Was a founding member of the Python Software Foundation, and sort of working at integrating open source into enterprise workloads, right? So figuring out I'm an enterprise, how can I leverage open source? And so that was sort of the background of where ActiveState got started. And then moving forward as the company evolved and went through a couple of different spin-offs and acquisitions, that kind of thing, always at the core we had this like open source, specifically around open source language ecosystems that was at the core. And we were doing some work around developing like secure build technology, right? So we're building all this stuff at scale. We're understanding how you maintain it at scale as well, and what are you've got gazillions of dependencies, right? And something like these days, like over 75% of any like open source application is like made up of, or any like commercial application is made up of open source, right? So anyone who's building a large scale application has got tons and tons of open source dependencies. And so we were building this sort of secure build technology. And then increasingly the sort of supply chain management side of things, where we're understanding, okay, where did I get the source code from? How was it built? Was it built in a secure way? Obviously, does it have any vulnerabilities, that kind of thing? And then how do we get it distributed? And that's sort of, we've kind of evolved our platform beyond just like Perl and Python to kind of encompass all open source and all the different ecosystems, and thinking about it in a way of, how do you deliver it in these various formats? And one of those is containers, right? So that's like the thing where today people are really, that's how they like to consume or deploy their applications. And so for us, we've been building up this huge catalog over time, and the system to build it at scale. And, it's a sort of a natural extension to say, oh, well, one of the ways that we can build it and distribute it to you is in a container.
All right. Well, it's like I said, it's something that I'm learning about, like step by. You've got a nice little pyramid, that pyramid line. That's like my discovery of this entire world, that I've hear these words and they make sense to me. I've certainly used open source software for a while. Knowing that you've been in it for a while is fascinating as well. How does container security though fit into that open source security space? How does it fit into that picture?
For sure. Go ahead, Evan, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think I can take this one. And Chris, I think like kind of extending on what Pete said, it really sort of is just a lot of the natural extension of what we've been doing for years and years now. I mean, even just going back to what Pete said a couple of minutes ago, we've been in the business of packaging up open source, ensuring it's built securely, and ultimately keeping it vulnerability free. And if you think about those three pieces, like all of that work is super relevant to containers as well. And, for us, we kind of know that a large portion of the software development world has either moved on to containers, is thinking about adopting containers, maybe it's on a modernization roadmap they've got. And really, we just want to have the ability to be where our customers are and meet them where they are in the way they're deploying their applications. And so I think as we get further into this conversation, we'll talk about, a little bit more into details about the technology we've kind of developed along those years and how that kind of plugs in and helps us support containers as well.
Well, I can only imagine what makes containers particularly challenging from a security perspective.
Right. So I think that one of the sort of obvious reasons is like containers tend to be production workloads, right? So they tend to be the things that are running somewhere on the internet and they're exposed to the world, kind of thing. And so that tends to be sort of a major use case there. And so being aware of their security profile and doing the things that you need to do, whether it's minimizing, reducing attack surface. So you just saw that graph there where we've got a catalog of like 40 million components, and I mentioned the thing about like 75% of your app being open source. You think about that, like that's a huge amount of code that you didn't write, right? You've got this pool of code that's running out there. You didn't write it. You didn't necessarily maybe even look at it that deeply, right? It's just pulling in dependencies that are maintained out there somewhere on the internet. So having visibility into all of that stuff and reducing the amount of things, that's going to be one big thing. And then it also tends to be like with containers, they tend to be kind of like they're layered, right? And so you can kind of like inherit vulnerabilities that in a similar way, like with the dependency, you might be using a library to, make a website or something, right? And you're saying, oh, I'll pick on a Python. I'm going to use Django or Flask or something like that, right? And I'm working on that, but you don't realize that thing actually pulls in 100 other libraries that it's using, right? And the same thing with a container, right? Is like you've got those layers, and it's like, okay, well, what's on the base layer that I'm using, right? Like you might be like, oh, it's really convenient for me to use a full operating system base layer because it's got a whole bunch of stuff on there. But that whole bunch of stuff, basically can make it a little bit easier for attackers to take advantage of. That's the sort of.
Well, then, I mean, you're talking about attackers and security. What does it look like, the container security for a typical software team today?
Well, I think it probably starts with vulnerability scanning is probably that's like what the table stakes thing that a lot of people are doing is like, I'm going to scan this thing for vulnerabilities and see whether it, does it have a vulnerability here? Is it, and what's the severity? Is it critical? Is it high, kind of thing? But I think there's a lot of other layers, like I'm talking about the dependencies that are like kind of supply chain concerns, where understanding exactly what's on there, kind of thing. So that's where we talk about an SBOM. So for people that are, that's a software bill of materials kind of thing.
BOM. Got it. BOM. Yeah. I wasn't sure. I was like, what? That sounds explosive. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So there's a thing called a software bill of materials. And what that is basically sort of think of it as like an official vetted list of all of the stuff that's in that container, right? And it will go all the way down to like the individual, files and libraries and stuff, and say like, this thing is on here. And if you're talking about a supply chain, you kind of talk about like a chain of custody, right? To say like, oh, well, ActiveState went out and got this source code from this GitHub repo, and then they built it in this particular way. And then, they scanned it for et cetera, et cetera. And you can say, in addition, so there's the SBOM, that's the list of things, and then you can follow, those are things that are called attestations that can basically tell you, yes, all of these steps have been followed. And so that's a good way to think about it there.
Okay,
yeah.
So go ahead,
Evan. Oh, no, and I was just going to say, and Pete, I think too, it's fair to say, the question was like, what are companies and organizations doing today? And I think part of that answer is like, they're also struggling a little bit. Like, you kind of have to build out this muscle to do a lot of the things Pete was describing, and get in the habit of making sure the scanner is integrated in the correct way, and that you're kind of doing these processes on a regular basis. And I think it's probably fair to say that right now a lot of organizations are also just trying to figure out how to even build that cultural change within their organization to some extent.
You know, as I said, it's a new space to me. I have looked very lightly, because y'all are in a different plane of existence as far as I'm concerned. But it's fascinating to me because I've heard about it, and I understand theoretically what a container is. It's my where I am. But what's the difference between your standard images and these?
I think probably the biggest, you'll hear terms like hardened thrown around kind of thing as a one way to describe these types of container images, or secure, and really, there's a couple of think about it. There's a couple steps that you're doing there. So the first one is that you are eliminating the vulnerabilities, right? So you're choosing versions of the components. Like, I'm making my website I'm making a Node.js website using Express, right? I'm going to pick a version of Express that doesn't have that has the vulnerabilities fixed, right? So usually that means staying current, basically getting, I'm going to use the latest version. And the other thing would be minimizing. So I talked about, like, a lot of times the cruft, or like the extra stuff, the additional attack surface, is like getting rid of things you don't need, right? So it's like, oh, you know what? If I'm going to deploy this website, maybe it doesn't need a shell on there, right? I don't need necessarily to have a shell on this container, because really it's not going to be used in production. So all it is a way for an attacker to get in and get access to the system, kind of thing. So eliminating unneeded components becomes a big part of it as well. And then there's like, things where you're just like reducing the permissions, kind of thing, right? A lot of these things, the defaults, right, are probably, they're more tuned to user convenience than they are to security, right? And so basically, when you layer all of these things, you've heard of the whole Swiss cheese model of security, this kind of thing. Like, if you layer all of these things together, what you get is something that is much more secure than what you would just get off the shelf, that is probably, like I said, targeted at like user convenience than security.
Okay. And again, you have to pardon how I frame this, but beyond scanning, how can teams effectively manage or mitigate effectively the vulnerabilities that might be tied to open source dependencies, or just dependencies, after a container is in production?
Right. So once one of the key things is updating frequently, right? And so you've got to have and so Evan was talking about like the sort of organizational discipline to make these changes and make these updates. Like, a lot of applications, I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but it's like a very high number. Like 80% of applications, like, once they're completed, are never updated.
Yeah.
Right. And like, that's when the bit rot kind of seeps in, right? Where you've got this thing running and it's just accumulating vulnerabilities over time. And so, you need to have the discipline or the pipeline, to have updates be deployed regularly. But I think what you also are looking at doing is spending the cycles to either build the strength on your team to say, we're going to look at what's actually in here, right? To understand, to generate an SBOM and look at, okay, here's what we're actually shipping. Do we actually need all of these things? So to reduce the overall attack surface, and just spend cycles. Because I think that one of the big things is that dev teams don't want to be working on this. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is not a super, thrilling thing that what they want to be doing is working on their website. Do you know what I mean? Or they want to work in their app, or they want to be working on their, their, really cool technology piece that they're working on. They don't want to be like managing vulnerabilities in their open source dependencies. They just want to be able to get on with their lives, kind of thing. And so teams either need to be sort of, if they want to be secure, they either need to be committed to doing that, or they need to seek out solutions that do this for them, right? So that they can get either drop-in replacements or kind of off-the-shelf things.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say too, before this question, we were talking a bit about like what actually are these hardened images? Like why have these kind of new entries into the market exist in the first place? And I think part of the answer to that is the things Pete was just describing that companies are trying to achieve to help solve the vulnerabilities when their apps running in production, is they have to go and do the work that these hardened images have already done for you. And that's, getting the bloat out of the images, really working on the minimizing, the freshness challenge Pete described, and really just understanding end to end, like how their container was constructed. And all of these problems are really hard, to be honest. And I think that's part of why we've seen this new market category of hardened images really explode in the past, even just a couple months, to be fair. So,
yeah, I think that to jump on there, I think one of the other things you said is, this stuff is really hard. Is in addition, there's also a bunch of research that goes into this, right? And it's like, is your team willing to do the research? Because sometimes, like, there might be a vulnerability in your container, but it might not actually apply to you, right? Like maybe your code doesn't use that, So there's like a thing called reachability, where understanding whether am I really subject to this vulnerability, and just doing that research is valuable, and like that can that research can accelerate your team, right? Because either your team's going to have to do the analysis and say, okay, this thing is actually, this is actually applies to us. It's actually important. We should pay attention to it. Or, you can kind of like offload that to another team who's going to do the research for you, kind of thing, and figure out, yeah, you know what? Yeah, this has this vulnerability in it, but you don't need to worry too much at this stage because it doesn't apply for X, Y, Z reason. It could be as simple as this, you're running a Linux version of this container, and this vulnerability is only available on Windows or something like that.
Right. That makes sense. Well, what should teams be keeping in mind then in terms of adopting container security? Like actually like working it into their processes, given that it sounds like they're not, on average, not to pick on every team out there, but what are the key capabilities they should look to develop to effectively harden themselves?
Well, I think that, one of the things is, think about it as like I don't know, you can call it an accounting system, right? And this is something that obviously we built up over a lot of years, is like knowing everything that you're running, right? Is like one of the first, because that's that stage where you can't know what you need to, slim down in a container unless you have a full kind of accounting of what's all the open source that I'm running, kind of thing, and what versions am I at, kind of thing, and what's the current state. So there's this kind of like discipline around like bookkeeping there around all of the stuff. And I mean, a lot of people, obviously, like all the different like language ecosystems have their own, way of, here's my package.json or my requirements.txt, where it's like a list of the things, but that's tends to be only like the top layer, right? And then there's the layer down below that, which is called transitive dependencies, kind of thing. And that's like, the things that it's bringing in as well. But then sometimes there's the layer below that where it's like, here are the system libraries that this relies on, right? Like this is assuming that your operating system is running this C library or something like that underneath it. And so you kind of have to know, especially for a container, because a container is, think about it as like, it's got a complete operating system essentially embedded in it, right? So you need to include all of that stuff when you put it in there. So that bookkeeping piece is like, that's step one. And then there's the sort of discipline pieces that Evan was talking about, right? Around whether it's automation, right? Like, so, I need to do this regularly, kind of thing. Like I don't want to, it's not like I scan the container once, deploy it to production, and then I'm done. Do you know what I mean? I need to be monitoring that on an ongoing basis to make sure that I'm getting all the information that I need about what the current state of it is. And then there's this sort of like, willing to investment in, I'm going to do the hardening, I'm going to do the slimming, I'm going to go and navigate potentially the dependency hell to be like, okay, well, I updated this version of the library. Oh, right. But now I have to update this one over here, and it becomes like a domino effect, right? Of like, And then it's like, oh, all of a sudden I had to update to a version that breaks my application. What am I going to do then? Oh, maybe I'll backport the patch. And like, there's all kinds of, it's one of these things that seems like really simple on the surface. And then when you start to peel back the layers, it's like, oh man, this is like a rat's nest of stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's like a big theme in a lot of the things you were talking about, Pete, where it's, everyone's heard the security thing of like shift left, but I do really think that a lot of the things organizations need to look to build out, it's all about starting at the front of the process as opposed to sort of letting these things build up and trying to deal with it after. You really need to build this muscle of like, we understand that to maintain our containers, there's going to be a bunch of steps and actions we need to take. Let's do that at the very front of this process so that we're all aligned on how it looks going down. Because the consequences are, I think Pete touched on this earlier, but like if you have to go and pull developers away to, remediate vulnerabilities down the line, it's a huge loss of productivity. And in some cases can even be as extreme as like, hey, you're halting the roadmap of your team's development altogether. And so you really don't want to get into a state where you're being reactive to say like, oh, vulnerabilities got thrown, it hit our threshold, and now we've got to go deal with it before we can do any, real value add work. So getting ahead of this is like one of the things you can do to make sure your team's focused, on creating new value and not this sort of undifferentiated work.
Okay, so I'm gonna frame it as my experience. So I'm in the process. This is for real. Not staged at all, but I'm in the process of developing a website, a service, right? And I don't know much about development. So when I was working with a DevOps guy, he's kind of handling and managing and doing what he needs to do to get the code production ready. We started to install like all sorts of stuff on my personal computer. And I mean, legit stuff, not like, he's trustworthy. And I thought, well, couldn't I just, instead of having all this code local to my machine, couldn't I get to it, quote unquote, in the cloud? Couldn't I have that in a container? Like, even if it wasn't the production environment that I was messing with, even if it was just like, a fork of that or whatever the terminology might be, me personally would rather mess with any of that stuff because of exactly what you're talking about. Because my next question to the guy was, yeah, but how does this, because I know that's an app, right? I know that's an executable. How does that get updated? Like, who updates that? Is that something I need to be mindful of? And he kind of, yeah. I'm like, no. That's like, this is my machine. So is what we're talking about something that could effectively help mitigate the risk for development environments like what I'm talking about? Because again, I'm not, I don't think your core customer necessarily yet, but it sounds to me like it would solve a lot of the problems that I might be running into before I run into them.
Yeah, well, development containers is something that's definitely kind of emerging as a space where there's a lot of convenience and a lot of benefit for that. You know what I mean? Let's go through. There's a couple of actual benefits there. That there's like the sandboxing one, which you're talking about. Is like, well, is this app safe? I know this is an executable thing. Is it safe to run on my machine? If you're running it in a container, it's sandboxed, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? You can. So if I download a container that has all my development tools in it or whatever, and I'm running them, they run in a sandboxed environment, right? And so it's not going to necessarily have access to your file system and things like that. So it's a little safer that way. And then additionally, for really complex tool chains, and you'll actually see, if you look at open source projects and large open source projects, a lot of them use containerized environments for building and onboarding people to the development of that application. I'll call it like the Python. If you want to run your own PyPI server kind of thing for the Python packages, it runs a series of Docker images kind of thing to build that locally, because otherwise, you'd have a really long README that was like, you need to install it. You just said like, your DevOps guy was like, he installed a whole bunch of stuff on my laptop. You know what I mean? Because otherwise you'd have to install a whole bunch of things on the laptop, and then you would have to manage it. You have to update it.
Yeah.
Whereas if I pull down a container, then that container will have everything in there kind of curated kind of thing. And it comes as a bundle.
That's what I want. That's what I want. Can I just say that? I feel like I'm at, a fast food. That's what I want. I want option number 3. That's what I want.
And that's becoming sort of a common pattern you're seeing emerge here with some of the tooling. So like, VS Code, for instance, has set up where you can run containerized environments for like, developing apps kind of thing, right? So
Yeah.
I can just like pull down, here's a Python one, or here's a Node one, or here's a Java one, or something like that, right? And I can pull that down, I can write my code, and then it runs in that container kind of thing that might already include all of the dependencies that you need. So you can see, like, for sure, if I'm like an open source maintainer, it becomes convenient kind of thing. And you're even seeing it start to appear in like some of the emerging like agent workflows on the AI side of things, where basically you've got agents and they're going to run in an environment. Well, how do you make sure that like your AI agent is running the exact set of tools and versions that you need for it to work on your code base? Well, a container is a really convenient way to do that, right? It's like, here you go, agent. Here's a in a development environment set up with all the exact versions you need. I know that it will work. Just go to town and fix my bugs or write my tests or whatever you got it doing.
Well, and it makes sense, like in terms of saving resources, saving time, energy, and that's everything to a business, right? Saving resources. But could you talk about the trade-offs between using a commercial solution for managing open source dependencies versus building an in-house system?
Yeah, there's a lot.
I'm sure. Yeah, how much time do we have?
I'll start, Evans. So basically, if you're using your own, like a commercial one has a lot of those functionality built in, like you were talking about, like in terms of doing the research, doing the automation, doing also like the building. So, if you want to build it in a way that's like, secure, there's a bunch of different standards around some of the supply chain standards. Like Salsa is one of them, where when we build something, we build it in a container kind of thing, right? So we have a container and we build it, and that container doesn't have access to the internet, right? And so it's going to build it, and it's going to know that not to go out and pull down something that hasn't been vetted, right? Like, it's only pulling from a vetted pool of artifacts and components. And so when you have a system like that, when you're using a commercial vendor, you can get the economies of scale. Like, I don't have to invest a ton of effort to build up this like distributed build system that tracks all of the components and signs them and is hermetically sealed, so it's not talking to the internet, and maybe has like a concept of version control around all of the tracking all the components, all that kind of thing. Versus if you do your own, like, obviously the community tools are very, very good. You know what I mean? You can stitch all of this stuff together. Like I said, every ecosystem, they have a package manager kind of thing where you can say, here's the list of stuff I want. It's going to go to NPM, or it's going to go to Maven or whatever, right? And it's going to pull the stuff down, and it's going to find all the the dependencies and build it up, kind of thing. But all of the sort of bookkeeping and like pipeline, you've got to do it yourself, kind of thing. So
yeah,
are you willing? Think about, like, are you willing to have a developer who's going to spend easily a third or more of their time, kind of thing, doing this, if they're versus spending that time on the core value for your business or something like that. So the trade-offs, especially if you're doing this at scale, you know what I mean, the trade-offs start to become pretty clear, because if you're, depending on how many open source things you've got, if you've got thousands of these things, that stacks up a lot. Even if you have 1,000 of them, if you were spending 5 minutes, you know what I mean, here and there on all 1,000, it's very quickly gets pretty expensive.
Yeah, and I'd really emphasize that part you mentioned too, Pete, about like you having to dedicate a developer to it, because let's say you're a bank and you want to solve this problem, like is it really worth your time, even if you have the best engineering team in the world, to dedicate them to solving this problem instead of, improving your mobile banking experience, instead of, doing the things that drive the revenue for your business? You could build the best build engine and system and, have this all sorted. But at the end of the day, you're not in the business of doing that. So why dedicate the resources? I think for most organizations is probably going to be the story.
But I guess a question then is, how is ActiveState approaching this problem differently in terms of solving container security challenges?
Yeah, I can take this. And we've got some slides too, if we want to pull them up. I think it's slide number 4. So we've talked a bit about some of this stuff already, but I can kind of go back through it. And I think so it all sort of stems from the status quo of container development today. And what we've noticed is, most teams are going to public repositories, places like Docker Hub, and sort of starting with getting their images from there. And just the unfortunate reality is so many of these images in Docker Hub are either predisposed to CVEs, they're not updated on a regular basis. They're kind of bloated, full of all the software you don't need. And so, earlier in this call, we talked about this market of hardened images that already exists that kind of comes in and solves this problem. And, I think they do a good job of that. They do what they set out to accomplish. They bring your image size further down. They reduce the attack surface of what those images can be. And that's great. And I think, that's the main reason that market exists. But what we've noticed is that, it doesn't stop there. Once you've got your base image that you want to build the rest of your container upon, there's still a challenge of, hey, my application is going to need certain dependencies to run, or I need to configure my container in a specific way for my needs. And that sort of begs the question of what happens next. And I think at ActiveState, where we're really focused is on that story of exactly what happens next. How can I customize my container to fit my exact needs while still achieving all of my security goals? How can I bring all those things from a minimal, hardened container from a different offering and bring that into what I need to do myself? And so where we've really focused is on this process after, which is how can we help you customize your image, and how can we maintain and kind of do that build process Pete was just describing for you and really offload that from your team altogether.
I think that's a really key is the offloading. And we said at the beginning, ActiveState's been around for what, 25 years or something like that. So we've accumulated this super deep database and knowledge set of how do you manage open source at scale, and how do you build it in a way that's that this is going to work, and that these things work together. And so I think a lot of entrants in this space kind of start with containers kind of thing and are kind of maybe starting to expand to packages, whereas we've kind of we've been building all the packages, this huge catalog of the individual, and it's oh yeah, well, we should also push containers as a different an additional distribution method kind of thing, right? And so we've got this sort of system in place that we built to assemble these components and build all the stuff from source and manage this stuff at scale. And so we're just kind of leveraging all of that deep institutional knowledge there to be able to bring that to the sort of secure container space.
Why is that important for containers in terms of what you've got? You talk about it, effectively having all this stuff, right? The knowledge, the experience, the catalog, if you will. Why is that important for containers?
I think it's what Evan was talking about in terms of the individual components and the ability to go all the way kind of thing down to, all of your application dependencies, and being able to have everything secured sort of end to end. So it's very frequent, with a container, oh, I'm going to pull a base one from, whether it's Docker Hub or wherever, right? I'm going to pull the base, but then I still have to layer my application on top of that, right? I still have to build my website, right? The base layer, to the base container doesn't necessarily have the libraries that I use to build my website. You know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily have this particular tool that I'm using. So, I have to put that stuff on top, right? To be able to actually get some use out of it. And that stuff is that's there are a lot of vulnerabilities. There's a lot of, management. The application size can be huge depending on the scale of your application. So that can be, the dominant set of stuff that's in your container, right? So for us, that expertise that we've had in managing that, all of those components at scale for components and sort of at the package level, that's, I think, where, we have this, we've got this build system, this sort of secret sauce of how we can bring that to bear on the container space and help make it even more secure, right? So we've got the base layers, got the the secure bases, just like everybody else, but we've also got this ability to layer on from that huge ecosystem I showed you before. It was like the 40 million different ecosystems, different languages that can all get layered on top, kind of thing. And to us, like the stuff that goes into the base layers, it's just another set of components, really, right? It's just, we've got the building blocks and we just sort of can assemble them together.
So, let's just assume some people out there are just hearing about y'all for the first time, like had no idea you existed, which is a great, reason to do these types of things. Do teams need to change their workflows at all in any way to use these containers? Is it a heavy lift? Is it, a big shift, or have you made that process more streamlined for them?
Yeah, I think, one of the great things about containers and us providing this open source and Docker containers is there isn't really a huge process shift. It's more about, starting with the right image you want to use to build your software upon. And so one of the great things here is they can grab an image from us, or really anyone who's, securing images, and plug them right into their pipeline. And so I think just by nature, the form factor kind of allows us to do this without having to really alter the way teams are working today. And I would say, for someone who is maybe more familiar with ActiveState and says like, hey, don't you have this platform? That, like, the answer is we do, but you totally don't have to touch that at all. We do have a platform that, kind of dovetails nicely into this, but all the technology we're using to make containers a reality is sort of just the output of that. So if you don't have any desire to touch any technology and you just want to get your container fully secured end-to-end and plug that into your pipeline, you can go ahead and do that. We've got that covered for you. So yeah, Pete, I don't know if there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I think that just that, it really can be positioned as a drop-in replacement to what you're doing now, right? So, I've got a container that I'm using for the development of my application. I'm currently using maybe one that's just a community one. Be like, oh, well, you can just like point it. So instead of pointing at where you're getting it now, you can point it at ActiveState and get it from there. And minimal friction kind of thing. It can integrate with all your existing pipelines, all that kind of stuff. And so that, like Evan said, that's one of the benefits of the containerized thing, is because you just grab this thing over here and I'll just drop it right into my existing workflow without having to adopt, new tools or, change undergo any kind of change management at my org, right? That's the thing, especially if you're a large organization, like, change management is hard in terms of, especially if you have a huge team of developers. So having something you can just like slot into your existing pipeline with just basically pointing to a different upstream, that's golden.
Yeah, and even earlier, I think I described a lot of the challenges are cultural. It's building out the processes to do this. And one of the nice things about getting your container secured, not just at the base layer, but across every layer of your application, is it reduces the amount of cultural change you need to apply. The more secure you are across the entire container image, the less you need to worry about all those finite steps. And so it's not to say you don't need to worry about container security at all, but we're definitely easing the process for you and making that adoption of these practices easier by just giving you something that's more secure at every single point of its kind of life cycle.
So does ActiveState make sense? This is genuine, like I said, does ActiveState make sense for someone like me? Someone who, I am going to be working with software. I admittedly am more of a vibe coder, right? Using the AI, we couldn't get through one of these things without bringing up AI, but also being very cautious, like with all these potential vulnerabilities that I'm opening myself up to, but knowing that I'm just starting out. I want to start out the right way. I want to start out the secure way, the safe way, the easy way. Does it make sense for someone like me who my needs may be meager compared to, let's say, a bank?
Yeah, for sure.
Of which I am not making at this point. You know what I'm saying? So
but we, for instance, like we do have a free offering, right? Where you can go to Docker Hub and you can pull down library of free images, whether it's like say you're working on your website and it's a Node.js thing,
Yeah,
you can pull down
it
the
is.
Node.js container, right? And we'll have variants of like whether it's for all the different ecosystems, and also like growing into like application containers too, right? Where you're like, okay, well, I need to run a database for my website, right? So I can pull down, instead of maybe using the default Postgres one or something like that, you could be like, oh, I'll pull a secure one. Do you know what I mean, for my Postgres, and then that will be part of my whole application stack, depending on what your architecture is, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, like we, even for if you just want to get started, we have a free offering that you can just pull down, and those are vulnerability free and minimized for you, and in the case of things like some of the development containers, curated so that you have like the common set of tools that you're going to want to get started.
See, that's a good answer. I like that answer because it's a good path forward, right? Like, okay, this makes sense to me. I'm listening genuinely, thinking, I don't think I could live without this. Like, it'd be for someone like me who knows enough, but also aware of the resources that could take away, should something go sideways. And it happens. It's code. In your slide, you even said, how many days are lost in productivity from having to keep up with this stuff. Like, I don't have time for that.
Yeah, well, especially even if you're an individual person, right? Like, it's like if you've got only a certain amount of time per week to allocate to building your website, if it's a hobby or something, do you really want to spend it chasing down dependencies and fixing vulnerabilities? Like, no, right? So
okay, for technical teams who may be listening out there, what practical tips or best practices could they, the opposite of me, incorporate into their daily workflows to contribute to a more secure open source supply chain for their organization's containerized applications?
I think that for the technical teams, obviously we talked a lot about discipline in this kind of thing, or like, and the sense of like doing it regularly, kind of like making a habit of doing this. So integrating it into their workflows or into their like development cycles, where it's not an afterthought kind of thing. It's like, to Evan was saying before, is like, the more you front load this, the easier it gets down the road. And so, I think that that's probably a big one. And then starting, like, the concept of, you just said there, you want to start out the right way kind of thing. Like, the more you start secure, that, you know what I mean? It's going to be easier, right? And so, I'd recommend that you look for that, there definitely are secure versions that are, hardened of most of the common use cases that you want to do. And so that's the place where you're going to start there and then have that kind of discipline. But you get a lot of benefits from, basically offloading this to somebody else. That's the other thing I would say, is that unless your team is like, this is part of your core expertise and aligned with, how your business makes money if you're a professional developer, like, the economics are definitely probably going to work in your favor, that it's always better to just be like, you know what, I should just get something off the shelf, I think, for this.
Again, you've got my head spinning. I'm like, okay, this is the thing I've got to do. I've got this. It's imperative. I think it's successful. Like, okay, yeah, how could an organization live without something like this? I can't imagine, unless that, as you pointed out, is their core competency to save them.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Pete, please.
I was just going to say, yeah, they can't live without it, really. Like, it's not, I don't think it's really optional. The amount of risk that it introduces into your business, not even just from a pure operational, like, you get hacked and your website goes down, you know what I mean? And people can't get to it. But there's also, like, what if does your business handle like personal information? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's lots of like liability things. There's increasing like regulation as well. Like, are you involved in regulated industry where you have to, increasingly have to comply with laws? So I think it's at the like enterprise scale, I think it's stopped being an optional endeavor.
Yeah. And P2, I think when you think of a lot of people who are tasked with solving technical challenges, the thing they want to do is just give me the thing that solves my problem right now. And so like kind of the tricky part if you're using containers is they provide a really, easy way to kind of circumvent compliance challenges or security challenges where it's just, I'm just going to grab what I need and go. And so I think to Pete's point, like you really do need to solve this at the front and sort of make sure you're curating the right resources for every team so that you can kind of start down that path without getting sort of sidetracked and having people just grab and go and not really care about security.
Okay. On the path of getting started, what's the fastest way to get started and start to see results?
So I think if you're, talking from our perspective, like Pete mentioned, we've got our first sort of set of free secure images available on Docker Hub now. You can find them by just going to Docker Hub and typing in ActiveState. As Pete mentioned, we've got a bunch for kind of your popular programming languages, the Python, the Java, the Node, and even going back to our history, one for Perl as well. And that's just the first set. We've got a lot more coming. So I would say stay tuned to Docker Hub, check out our website and see what we're working on. And then the second part of that is if you are interested in the customization problem we were describing and you want to see what that looks like in theory, you want to say, hey, I just want to get my image customized. I don't want to have to deal with it at all. We are also offering a little trial where effectively you'll meet with our team. You'll drop us your requirements in the SBOM format, like Pete mentioned, or through another format. And we'll go away and we'll build that for you. We'll do the customization work on an image you need, and we'll give it back to you so you can evaluate if that meets your demands. And so I would encourage people who are curious what that process looks like to, fill out the form linked below and give it a try. I think they'll be very happy with the results. So I'd say, if you just want a free version, you want to check it out, Docker Hub. If not, reach out to us and we'd be happy to start that customization for you.
So, okay, so you said Perl. What about Fortran?
It's funny. Fortran, Fortran actually is in our stack kind of thing. There's a couple of like Python scientific computing libraries that use Fortran under the hood. So actually there is we do have a Fortran compiler. It is like part of our thing.
COBOL?
No, I don't think COBOL's in there.
Okay.
I don't think COBOL's in there.
Okay, and I'm going to throw you for a loop. Punch cards?
No punch cards. No punch cards. No, go that back. But the thing is, we have historically done builds on now exotic hardware kind of thing. It's decreasing over time, but where we have done, ported Perl and Python and things like that to somewhat exotic architectures.
Well, I've seen legitimate, in the wild, modern day point of sale terminals running Commodore software, C64 stuff. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of legacy applications out there. So yeah, and they just keep going. Like I said, they don't get updated. So
see, I'm not old. I'm just legacy. That's
that's the term I use for myself, legacy.
All right. So where do you guys see container security heading in the next year or two? What's most exciting for you on this front?
I think that AI is going to have a big role to play, right? I think everybody says AI, but I think that the reality is, like I said earlier, the scale of the problem necessitates it in a way, kind of thing, right? It's just, I think you're going to see increased adoption. I think that this is, like we said, this adoption of containerization. I think that, I don't know what the percentage is off the top of my head. It's around 30 to 40% of applications are currently containerized. I think you're going to see that continue to grow, right? Obviously, as the legacy applications sort of fall off, you're going to see the containerized ones pick it up. And I think, essentially any new project today is probably going to use a container-based solution for its deployment, because that's going to be that's the easiest way, most secure, most modular, that kind of thing. So I think you're going to see continued adoption and growth in the container market. I think that's going to continue to be the place where you see all the growth. And I think that you're going to see more introduction of AI into this space to help deal with some of these problems at scale, kind of thing. And to say whether it's on the identification side, to say what's the what are the vulnerabilities, or the remediation side. How do I deal with this? Is this really applicable to me? How can I fix this? How can I patch it, etc.?
Evan?
Yeah, I would say sort of my answer is I think an extension of Pete's, where it's, we talked about a lot of things like, hey, it's hard to minimize and secure these base images. Once you do that, you've got to customize and layer on top. And again, you sort of reintroduce the same problem, and there's a lot of manual work to go and solve that. And so, we talked about how we're kind of offloading some of that work for you. And I think what I'd be interested to see in the future is just how far we can take that. Like, can we totally eliminate this process from organizations? Can we, transition even further into the service realm? Like, is there a world where you just say, here's the thing I need, here's the, 10 components I need added to it, click a button and here you go. Like, I think it's just leveraging what Pete was talking about, the AI and automation, to really bring any sort of human out of the loop on this equation and just say, like, sort of truly make this problem go away to some extent. But yeah, I don't think we're there yet, but I think that's sort of the direction we'll see things go.
Well, I tell you, this conversation was incredibly timely for me. I do single page web applications, straight up HTML. Like, I can understand it. There's obviously JavaScript in there, but like moving myself, into that realm of, okay, I want to be able to do something a little larger, and messing with code. We're going to be using, I think, Node.js, and then having to think about not just what I want to do, but how am I going to manage what it is that I want to do? That's my experienced entrepreneurial, product manager cap that I'm wearing. Mm-hmm. So this was a very, very, very timely conversation, very illuminating. And I appreciate your time, both Pete and Evan, in doing this.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us on. Yeah.
Absolutely. Happy to do it anytime. Like I said, this is becoming my world very fast. So thank you for your time, your attention, and your expertise.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Everybody, thanks again. If you're watching live, this will be available after the fact. If you're watching it after the fact, you obviously knew that this was live. So thanks again for paying attention. Be sure to check out the resources. Everything will be emailed if you've registered or pre-registered for this. Or as Pete had said, and Evan, you can try it right now. Go over to Docker Hub and search for ActiveState. Do it.